the day before the race, the organisers announced that they actually couldn't afford to pay the prize money. The riders were reluctant to race for Brazilian promissory notes instead of actual payment. They threatened a strike, and so it was all very, very fraught.
Bom dia. Welcome to the latest Paddock Pass Podcast, and we're previewing the 2026 Brazilian Grand Prix at the Ayrton Senna International Circuit. I've gone for the anglicised version of that, Dave. Am I allowed to?
You certainly are, because I've got no idea how to pronounce Goiania.
Well, knowing you're such a big fan of F1 as well, Ayrton Senna might even be a stretch for you. So we'll let it off there. I'm Adam Wheeler. I'm joined by David Emmett, you've just heard, and of course, Neil Morrison, who I know in particular is very much looking forward to getting tucked into this episode of the Paddock Pass Podcast. And we've got quite a lot in store for this show. In part, I would say, to make up for the fact that neither of us, or none of us, are going to be on the ground in Brazil this weekend. I think it might be the only Grand Prix where we have to call in absent. Is that right, guys? I mean, it's not like we all have other plans, but it's just that Brazil logistically has proven to be a little bit difficult on this occasion. Neil, what are you going to be up to? Obviously, we're all working this weekend while round two of the current championship's on. But you haven't put the suitcase away over the last few days, have you?
I haven't had, no. I was on holiday last week, in fact. I went to lovely Slovenia for the first time, which was really, really nice. Not going to Brazil. It is very, very expensive. It is also just before Austin, which I will be attending. And the thought of a 30-hour plus journey to Goiania was a bit too much for me. So, sitting this one out, but very excited for the return of the Brazilian Grand Prix, as we're going to come on to. I mean, it is one of the more lively and slightly chaotic Grand Prix in the history of the MotoGP Championship. And, very much excited to see how things go.
Dave, you must be thrilled by the fact that the clock has swung the other way and you can indulge your fondness for late evenings by actually watching motorcycles and then writing about them into the early hours.
Yeah, exactly. No, these races always suit me an awful lot better. So I am, I'll be able to get up and watch FP1 and all the rest of it. It'll be great. I might even watch Moto2 and Moto3.
Oh, goodness. And watch out for any kind of tuk-tuk races. I'm not sure they obviously don't have any tuk-tuks out in Brazil, but I'm not sure what the equivalent would be. First, a little bit of housekeeping on this show. We've had a competition running for some paddock passes to an event of a listener's choice through our Patreon channel, and we've got a winner. And we're going to be announcing that in a couple of days on Thursday on our first Paddock Note show, which will be free for everybody to listen to. But it was also the introductory show to our Notes service throughout the Grand Prix weekend. So, keep an eye on your podcast streaming outlet platform or whatever on Thursday, because you might be one of the lucky few patrons that scoops up those tickets for 2026. And we're also backed by Rental, but our association with these people, or these lovely people, are coming to a close in a couple of weeks. So if you want some brand exposure, you want to make people aware, a loyal, dedicated following of motorsport, Superbike, MotoGP, and more, then get in touch with us. We've got some space at the top, and of course during our show to relay any messages or promotion for your brand. So, but in the meantime, thank you to Rental, and use rental.com to find any new bars, grips, chain wheels, chains, and other accessories. Simply go through the website. You can order from anywhere in the world, and they have a Fit My Bike tool, so you can order exactly what you need for the exact motorcycle that you have. On the show today, we're talking about the 1989 Brazilian 500cc Grand Prix. Easy, Neil, we're almost there. And we'll be looking back at that race. We've got a link that we found on YouTube. It's not the finest quality. I think that's an understatement. But we're going to talk about sort of a little bit of that season, and, of course, going to the Ayrton Senna circuit there in Goiania. That's probably pronounced wrong, but there we go. Staple Paddock Pass Podcast ingredient. We've also got a very fascinating chat with Craig Scarborough, who's a motorsport technical journalist, and he's going to tell us all about some of the latest aerodynamic trickery. Just very quickly, Neil, how did that chat go with Craig? Because that's the first time for him on the podcast. Did he give away any secrets?
He gave Probably the best explanation that I've heard yet of how Aprilia's new system with the ducts, which are closed and opened with the rider's forearms, how that works. So that will be dropping later in the show.
And that's going to be, right towards the end of the podcast. So hold on for that. But first of all, we're going to travel back in time. Dave, what age were you in 1989?
Hang on. How old was I in 1989? 25.
Were you bald then?
Not far off. Bits of my head were bald.
Yeah, you were willingly bald, perhaps.
Yeah, in fact, I think that might have been. I can't remember whether I was still living in the UK or whether I'd moved back to the Netherlands. But anyway, yes, it was a long time ago. I was a much younger, fitter, and more stupid man. Even more stupid than I am now.
Neil, Grand Prix racing went to this particular part of Brazil for 3 years, 1987, 1988 and 1989. We saw 2 world championships crowned at this circuit, both for Rothmans Honda. Wayne Gardner being the first Australian world champion in the Premier class, let's not forget, in 87. And then Eddie Lawson completing the 4th, the first rider to go back-to-back with different manufacturers in the Premier class, I believe, if that's if my information is or my memory is correct. But is it also just one of those happy coincidences in life that it was the last Brazilian Grand Prix at this particular site, and it coincided with being a truly memorable Grand Prix season as well?
I mean, I think from the moment it came on the calendar in '87, it was quite a memorable place. I mean, we weren't there. I don't even think any of us were covering Grand Prix racing at the time, but
not even me.
Not even close. But it was a chaotic place. I think it was traditionally the end of the season place where everyone would go and let off steam and have very memorable parties after the racing was done and dusted. Sometimes even before the racing was done and dusted. In fact, sometimes I think pretty often it was as soon as they touched down there. There's been lots of very funny photographs. I think that were in Matt Oxley's book, The Age of Superheroes, about Grand Prix riders hosting wet t-shirt competitions or beauty contests as well. Randy Mamola was often seen taking all of his clothes off and parading up and down in his Y fronts in the local nightclub. It just seemed to have that sort of other era feel, more so than other races even of that era, when things were all a bit slapdash and last minute. And I mean, this wasn't just kind of this wasn't just down to Goiania. I think anytime we've had a Brazilian Grand Prix, we had one in Interlagos in 1992, which is, the Formula One Brazilian Grand Prix circuit. We had it at Rio de Janeiro in Jacarapagua from 1996 through to 2004. I think those circuits also brought a bit of party and chaos to the calendar. So I'm very curious to see whether this weekend is any different.
It was the contrast with the modern era of riders just couldn't be greater, because that was the story of lots of young men going abroad and imbibing lots of alcohol and meeting lots of nice young ladies, and now they're all happily married and very much more serious and much less party, much more
austere,
athlete.
Dave.
Austere, yes, very, very austere. But I think that's just professional sports now. Professional athletes now, especially also because they start at sort of shortly after gestation, and they have no life beyond their sport, and so they don't emerge as fully rounded characters.
The 1989 500cc World Championship, again in Michael Scott's book, not Motorcourse, the other one that he briefly did, he described the riders, the protagonists of that season, as the big three. We had Eddie Lawson, of course, we had Wayne Rainey in the second full year, I think on the Lucky Strike Yamaha. We had Kevin Schwantz on the Pepsi Suzuki. Oh, but he's still on my beating heart. What a motorcycling vision that was. And just a fantastic sort of era of expression, I think, in the Premier class, with the technology, the talent, the characters involved. We'll get onto that a little bit in a moment, but we're basing some of our observations and material in this podcast from this YouTube clip that we'll paste in the description and through our social media channels. And I just wanted to ask you both what you thought of the track, because coming up to 2026, when MotoGP is going to be appearing there for the first time, it's now 52 years old. It's quite short. I would say the layout is even sort of reminiscent of the Circuit de Barcelona Catalunya. And I think it looks quite good, actually. There's some sort of very open corners, a lot of double apexes. It remains to be seen how MotoGP would tackle it, but for the 500s, it was, some hard braking points, changes of direction. It looked quite spectacular. What did you think, Dave?
Well, first thing I noticed was how much runoff there was. Because the infield was completely empty. I mean, the runoff was all grass then because they didn't have gravel traps. But yeah, it seemed to be. I don't want to say lacking character. It was an interesting track. It wasn't a great track, but it did seem to have a certain amount of variation. It seemed to be pretty good. It was there was a little bit of everything, but it wasn't amazing.
Neil, the Brazilian Grand Prix, like you mentioned, it was a bit haphazard. I mean, we're in a pre-MotoGP Sport Entertainment Group, pre-Dorna era. There was various groups trying to control Grand Prix racing at the time. And again, thanks to Michael's book and the fantastic background on the event, the riders even arrived there, and there was a danger that the 1989 GP wasn't going to go ahead because there was a lack of prize money. I mean, IRTA were fully implicated in trying to get the situation sorted out, but then they also had an interest for 1990 and the Grand Prix happening in Rio, under the control of Bernie Ecclestone, who they had a sort of a side agreement going on with. So there's all sorts of politics swirling around the paddock. There was also, if you remember, not aborted attempt, but there was that controversial Belgian Grand Prix at Spa that was halted early. The points were still to be decided through a court or a tribunal or something. So it wasn't quite clear how much of a points lead Eddie Lawson had over Wayne Rainey going into the final Grand Prix. Rainey had pretty much shot his championship chances. He'd blown them up in smoke after the crash, I think, in Sweden at the previous Grand Prix. It just seemed, I mean, there was all sorts of crazy shit going on, like Randy Mamola, of course, who had been riding for Cagiva for 2 years by that point. This was his second season. He actually missed practice for the Grand Prix along with Kevin McGee because their flight had been cancelled. It seems crazy now that you're not leaving enough time to be able to get to the Grand Prix if you miss a flight. It just seems a little bit like the Wild West.
Exactly. Yeah, I was reading about the first run in this GP in '87. I think the freight arrived a day late there, and also Randy Mamola's Dunlop tyres at that particular time. He was racing against Lawson and Gardner in that year, who were on Michelin's, and his Dunlop tyres arrived in Rio, but then mysteriously went missing. So he had to use these kind of basically standard Japanese Dunlops, which were nowhere near as good as the ones that he would normally ride. So yeah, it seemed to be an event that was, that went hand in hand with slightly strange, mysterious happenings and haphazardness. And yeah, as you said, the complication with the Belgian Grand Prix, it had been stopped twice because of weather conditions, and basically at Spa, yeah, and basically the second restart, so the third run-in of the race, results were taken at the end of that, but then afterwards the FIM realized that went against the rules and they could only take results after the second restart, so they actually went back and took the results from the first restart, the second actual run-in of the race, and it meant that the kind of the third race, as it was null and void. And I think Rainey had won that, and was mightily pissed off at how that eventually turned out. So you had this, and also you had this kind of crazy silly season thing. I mean, silly season now is wrapped up for the following year, before the first race of the current season, more or less. At this point, we were going into the last race of the year. No one was sure whether Eddie Lawson was going to stay with Honda. There were rumors that he was actually going to go and replace Kevin Schwantz at Suzuki for the following year. And I think Schwantz was heavily linked to move across to Marlboro Yamaha with Giacomo Agostini. He really wanted to be on the exact same tools, the exact same bike as his great rival Wayne Rainey. So yeah, you had this kind of crazy situation as well, where no one really knew what the lay of the land would be the following year.
Dave, also people may point the finger at MotoGP these days and say, yeah, it's too sanitized, too controlled. There's too many. Oh, there's some very overbearing chefs in the kitchen, basically whipping everything up. But we should also be a little bit thankful for that, right? Because I mean, look how it used to be. I mean, amateur hour just from a distance of time and perspective, it doesn't seem to cover it.
No, I mean, you used to get start money. You used to get start money, which you had to collect after the race. So if you crashed during the race and you were in hospital, you had to hope that the promoter would be willing to give you your start money. And there were multiple occasions where riders would turn up after the race at the promoter's office and find the door locked and the gone fishing sign up. So they would literally have raced for nothing, prize money, all the rest of it for nothing. And yeah, safety was a race by race basis. Organisation, there was no organisation. I mean, they do say, let's organise this thing and take all the fun out of it. But sometimes it can have an upside to everything actually arriving on time. Although I have to say that Neil's explanation of what went on at Spa-Francorchamps was a little bit too reminiscent of Moto2 at Buriram, finding out what points we're supposed to be giving.
It's we're talking, of course, from a position well after the event, from reading and both in books, yes, they do exist, and websites, and seeing things like grainy pictures on YouTube, and we luckily are in a position to be able to call on some friends and colleagues who were there. And Neil, you spoke with Michael Scott himself a little bit, who was in Brazil for those Grand Prix, and he gave us a bit of a flavour of what it was like being on the ground.
I mean, some of the subsequent races in Rio were pretty mad, but nothing quite like Goiania. And if you'll indulge me, I was doing a bit of research earlier and reading my reports from the time, and I was struck by some of the paragraphs. And if you let me read a bit briefly,
please,
as fast as I can. This is from the very first race.
This was 1987, right?
1987. Race one where Gardner won the World Championship, in fact. Events off the circuit at Goiania proved there were things far more dangerous than racing motorcycles. One was related to the GP and the influx of traffic to the medium-sized city in the hot and dusty Brazilian hinterland. Hooting cars thronged at speed on whichever side of the road offered more space. Weaving among them, bike riders, helmetless and in open shirts, whooping with glee at ever more daring feats of jam-busting. Quote, Brazil has the worst road safety record in the world, a tour guide told me, adding proudly, and Goiania has the worst record in Brazil. There were 16 fatal bike accidents on the day before the Grand Prix. That was nothing compared with the silent killer lurking in the grim shanty towns on the outskirts of town. That was cesium-137, a highly radioactive component that became familiar to the world after the Chernobyl disaster. A cylinder of this, quote, brilliant powder, part of some disused X-ray equipment, had been left lying around after a hospital had been demolished. Some kids had found it, and within a few days the cylinder had been opened and the powder scattered by the games of the slum dwellers, fascinated by its phosphorescence. All this took place while the Grand Prix was in progress, and when the news broke the next week, when the unfortunate victims had been admitted to hospital with severe and, in many cases, ultimately fatal radiation burns, a shiver ran down racing spine as people wondered if they too had been exposed, and wondered how long they would have to wait to find out. By the time everyone got to Buenos Aires a week later, the papers had pictures of men wearing radiation suits stalking the streets of Goiania, parts of which had been sealed off. So that kind of sets the scene. And I mean, the racing was great, but the parties even more so.
Yeah.
Two smart hotels in town at that time, and everyone stayed in one or the other. Everyone convened in it was called Castro's Retreat, I think. the bar in the better of the hotels, and the parties were just fantastic. End of season, marvelous. At the time, it was, I think it's probably changed quite a lot now. They describe it as a financial hub now. At that time, it was, the city itself was quite small, surrounded by the usual shanty towns and so on. It had an absolutely crazy atmosphere. At the time, inflation was completely mad in Brazil at that time. So that everybody got paid on Friday, and they would immediately go to the supermarket and spend all their money, because if they waited a week, they would only get half as many goods. And that kind of spend it now atmosphere pervaded the whole place. Everybody was having fun because they couldn't afford not to, really. On the second, or was it the third running? It was the second, I think. They had three races at Goiania. And the announcers on the day before the race, the organisers announced that they actually couldn't afford to pay the prize money. The riders were reluctant to race for Brazilian promissory notes instead of actual payment. They threatened a strike, and so it was all very, very fraught. But it emerged, with lots of running around by IRTA and the FIM, it emerged that, in fact, some of the teams hadn't paid their freight bill because they'd been waiting for an invoice which had never been issued by Brazil. So it was rescued at the last minute. Typical last-minute stuff for Brazil. Because, of course, the Argentinian round should have followed, but that had been cancelled. So leaving Brazil to pay all the freight costs, which they couldn't afford.
If you want to hear the rest of Michael's chat, then we've got the full episode or full little interview over on our Patreon channel. So head to patreon.com/Paddock Pass Podcast. Quickly join us there, and you'll be guaranteed lots of other content, but you'll be able to hear the full exposition from Michael on what it was like working at the Ayrton Senna circuit for those 80s Grand Prix. Let's move on to the race itself then. And what's the first thing? We got a couple of categories to go through, actually, because we thought we'd split it up that way rather than just try to review the race itself. But first, Neil, just give me a bit of context again about 89, because it was the time when America was ruling motorcycle Grand Prix racing. The Brazilian Grand Prix was the 9th time that season, in a season, Dave, that had, 15, 16 events? Remember those? The 9th time where all three, Kevin Schwantz, Eddie Lawson, Wayne Rainey, finished on the podium together. As you mentioned, they were very much the powerhouses of the Premier class at that point. Bizarrely, we had 4 British riders in the top 17 at the Brazilian Grand Prix. I think Christian Saron on like a sort of semi-works Yamaha, but obviously in a privateer team, what would be the equivalent of, say, like LCR Honda these days, was 3rd in the championship, which seems a little unbelievable. But yeah, going to Brazil, I mean, what was the story? It was all about sort of Rainey and Lawson, really. Was Schwantz just like being that annoying mosquito buzzing around and could potentially upset things?
Yeah, well, I mean, I know we've had some like all-star packed grids in our time. I think you look back to maybe 2018 and you think like, wow, that was a grid so deep and so rich in talent. I would maybe make the case for this being the most complete and like all-star packed grid ever. I mean, you had 6 500cc Grand Prix champions, past or future, on the grid in Lawson, Rainey, Schwantz, Gardner, Doohan and Spencer. I mean, that is a roll call of just absolute legends of the time. That's before you even get to the likes of Randy Mamola, Christian Saron, Brent Francesco Keeley, Kevin McGee, Neil McKenzie, Ron Haslam, Rob McElnay, Bobby Schubert. I mean, yeah, even John Kaczynski and Luca Cadalora showed up in that season as well as one-time riders. And they obviously went on to become Grand Prix champions as well. And yeah, it'd been this kind of crazy back and forth all season long. In fact, it hadn't really been back and forth. It was more Rainey set the pace. Schwantz was probably the fastest out of that 3, but he was incredibly inconsistent, and he also had a bike which broke down a lot. So Schwantz, I think, finished 1st or 2nd in every single race that he finished, but he had 6 DNFs, and a couple of those were just like so stupid and so needless, like crashing from, I think, 6 or 7 second lead in Jerez when he was pretty much home and dry, but he just wanted to win by the biggest margin possible. So yeah, and Lawson basically made this sensational switch at the end of '88 from the all-seeing, all-conquering Agostini Yamaha team to Rothman's Honda. No one had seen it coming. I think Wayne Gardner, who was also his biggest rival and Rothman's Honda stable, found out about the move at a news kiosk in an airport at the end of the '88 season, and said something along the lines of thanks for nothing to Honda when he found out. He was really unhappy. But Lawson was in a kind of separate part. You had Doohan and Gardner in the factory Honda team, and then Lawson had his kind of own team created with Irv Kanemoto as his technician. And the '89 NSR Honda was like a real dog. Like, it was all power, and that was it. It was just no consideration given to braking, no consideration given to how the bike handled. I think they went through something like 11 chassis that year to try and get it to become competitive. And it was only Lawson's kind of brilliant sort of consistency that kept him in the hunt. And it was in that last maybe third of the season when he actually got to the level where he was like the fastest guy in the class. So yeah, you had the situation where he was kind of catching Rainey in the final part of the season, and Rainey, I think, was feeling a bit of the pressure. And then he had that crash that you mentioned, I think 2 races before in Sweden. So essentially the title was done and dusted by the time we got to Brazil. I think Lawson technically had a 15.5 point advantage over Rainey. He just kind of needed to bring it home and to finish it. But up until that point, it had been this kind of epic slog between Lawson and Rainey, and they had been good friends coming through the ranks in America. But I think in this season, the sort of the pressure of fighting for like the biggest gong in motorcycle racing really started to tell, and their relationship suffered a bit. So there was a decent bit of animosity between the three, because obviously we know that Rainey and Schwantz hated each other's guts massively at this point too.
I think I mentioned LCR Honda earlier, Neil. That's probably the closest example for the setup that Eddie Lawson had, right? I mean, it was similar equipment and just in a satellite operation. And now, thanks to sort of the LCR partners, whatever, they're probably closer than ever to sort of the HRC factory team. I mean, it was a good summary. But the '89 season was also remarkable in other ways. I mean, it was the first time we saw Phillip Island. I mean, what a cracking race that was. Really, really good. Maybe it was also the last Swedish Grand Prix we had, with the one that Rainey tipped out. I'm not sure if there was one in 1990, but that track in Anderstorp. If you go and watch video footage of that again now, that's also something like from some other era. 89 was one of those. I don't know why it also sticks in the memory so vividly as well, but. We're basing our podcast, as we said, on the video footage you can find on YouTube. And heading into the Grand Prix, we're breaking this podcast up in some categories. Dave, the first one we said was, what did we like? What did we like about watching this video back, this Grand Prix back? What was the thing that sort of popped out at you and said, I missed that?
I missed that. I don't know. It was motorbike racing. I mean, what I really liked about it was motorbike racing, and it's very similar to, motorbike racing hasn't changed. It's who can go fastest on a motorbike. And it was built up in the same way, you get people, basically Rainey Lawson and Schwantz breaking away, and you can see them being patient in that first part of the race, waiting as the fuel dropped down, waiting for their tires, managing their tires before actually sort of like pushing towards the end. That wasn't very different. I mean, that was what struck me, was really, motorbike racing hasn't really, the bikes are so utterly different in every single aspect. But, the idea, the principle behind it, athletes, people riding motorbikes as fast as possible and managing their machines over the length of a race, the duration of a race. Yeah, that's still the same, and that's still as vivid as ever.
The thing that stood out for me was that the motorcycles were motorcycles. I mean, you saw the suspension working, they were kind of bucking and moving around, seeing the right hands revving blipping the throttle, to change gear. It was a real sort of throwback in that aspect. And I thought, I'm not saying they were fighting the bikes, because obviously they're trying to set them up to be as pliable as possible to make the best speed over the course of 32 laps or whatever it was. But it just, like you say, it looked like proper motorcycling instead of engineering, if that makes sense. What was the thing that stood out for you, Neil?
I think it was just the fact that you had this. I mean, it was a title decider. Admittedly, Lawson only needed to finish, but the fact was that he was not willing to just tour around and finish fifth. He was right at the front, getting stuck in this race. I mean, he led I think the majority of it, with Rainey close behind, and there was just this kind of like bubbling tension between the two of them, which had been there all year long, with 500s being as fickle as they were, there was always that sort of mild fear. With Lawson, it was a bit different because he was generally more consistent than others. But there was this mild fear that something might intervene and he might just have that moment which kind of would lead his championship dreams to come tumbling down. But it was more just the sort of the aspect of watching, these three great guys racing at the front together.
Can I make a worthy mention for the liveries? I know they're tobacco brands, but just seeing sort of those prominent colours, the Rothmans Honda, you had the Lucky Strike Yamaha. I mean, they switched on to Suzuki for the following season. Of course, like I mentioned, the Pepsi delivery as well. It just seemed like Grand Prix racing, even though we've mentioned it was disorganised and a little bit erratic, it was still sort of drawing big money in those days. It was a completely different marketing, environment.
It was drawing big tobacco money because tobacco advertising had been banned. Tobacco had nowhere else to go. It went into sports. Motorcycle racing wasn't drawing big money. It was drawing big money because the money had nowhere else to go. We did have Pepsi because it was a massive sport in the US at the time, which I think was really that to me is much bigger. But it is you can also sort of see how much less money was needed to go racing by the fact that there were so fewer stickers on the bike, there were so fewer sponsors. Perhaps that's also like a matter of the commercialization of the sport.
Yeah, also the fact that you had Simon Buckmaster finishing 12th in the championship in 1989. I mean, he was a proper privateer. So it was a sign that, you could still be relatively competitive. I mean, top 15 in the championship if you were a total privateer, like showing up with, a couple of technicians in the back of a van and with very little backing.
Yeah, I mean that's one of the biggest changes is now everyone is now pretty much at the same at a very similar level. Even if you look at sort of the poorest Moto3 team now is still much more better funded and more organised than some of the privateers from the 500 GP era in that era.
And what's also interesting, even from Scotty's account of this 89 race, was that 21 bikes on the grid was seen as a bit of a poor entry. It was seen as sort of weaker numbers. And we know that the sport will go into even more difficult period or difficult moments in years to come, with the sort of disparity between the machinery and the competitiveness. The fact that Simon Buckmaster could finish 12th in the championship, which I think was the position Maverick Vinales finished in 2025. And really do that, what was maybe on an RG 500. I mean, a motorcycle that might have been 2 to 3 years old. There were a couple of those circling around in Brazil. It's quite staggering and also an indication of how times have moved on. Let's move a little bit on to what we kind of didn't like, watching that race back. What things did we think, okay, not quite what has aged worse, because we'll move on to that in a moment, but things that just didn't really, we thought, well, that was a bit shit. Can I just make an honorable mention here for the TV director, because he completely missed the winner at the end of the video. So people who want to watch this clip, don't get your hopes up for some memorable celebration shots. It kind of peters out, really, has to be said. But I would like to just make a mention for and also talking about that, we should also be grateful for Dorna's or MotoGP Sport Entertainment Group's product when it comes to the live broadcast, because yes, completely different level. I mean, maybe 50 years of difference in terms of technology and efficiency. But safety, I think if you look around the track now, that will also be one eye or one area of scrutiny that happens this week, But if you look at the 89 GP, it felt like some of those Armco barriers were pretty close. The curbs were massive. I mean, you mentioned the grass and the runoff day, but I think it looked pretty damn sketchy if you went a little bit wide. The track sort of seemed pretty bumpy in places as well and quite slick off the racing line. So, before we sort of throw daggers at MotoGP in 2026 over possible safety concerns, we should remember where we were not that long ago.
You say about the TV direction, but it's also obvious that the whole thing, they basically had like 5 cameras around the entire circuit. And I've got no idea how many they have now. They must have maybe 20.
Like 14, 15 on trackside.
Yeah, exactly. And that's before we start talking about the helicopter and the drone cameras and the pit lane cameras and the and all of the onboard stuff. It's such a completely different experience. Also, you can, watching it was quite funny. It was a bit of a throwback to watching absolutely terrible TV picture quality on awful CRT screens back when I was a young man. So yes, things have moved on a lot. Technology has advanced an awful lot.
Yeah, it was like the old NHSs. Do you remember VHSs? Do you remember you'd be able to tape over the VHS with something that you had on TV at that time? And I remember there was like 5 or 6 different recordings on top of each other on some of the old bike tapes that I would have in my house. You would you'd be like, oh, there's such and such highlights on now, like I have better record it, and hastily chuck the VHS in the recorder and hit record. And the quality would then decline with each kind of passing recording. So yeah, when you watch this clip on YouTube, you realize it kind of brings you back to that period where you're like, is that really Kevin Schwantz in the lead? Like, it's just this white little dot that I can see. There's no real sort of finesse or quality to the image.
And this is actually quite a good recording.
Yeah, it's amazing now. That's how I watched the 1989 season. It was through VHS cassettes, and it was done through a company called Duke Marketing in the UK. My dad had signed up for a scheme whereby they quickly edited the Grand Prix highlights, or the main race was the full duration. They would copy these things and mail order them out. So we'd be watching the Grand Prix 4 or 5, 6 days afterwards. But this sort of cassette would plop through the letterbox, and that would be the way we watched GP racing. And of course, in 1989, certainly in the UK, we're only a couple of years away from the introduction of satellite television, when we could start to enjoy Eurosport, and the GPs were broadcast live there. I mean, that was incredible. That was it broke down the barriers to enjoying and recognizing sport in a completely different way. I mean, everything we know now about this multi-billion-dollar TV sport licensing broadcast landscape happened, after this sort of Grand Prix season. So it's quite a time capsule, I think, of how we, ingested sport, if you like. Neil, was there anything you kind of didn't like, really?
I mean, it was aside from the quality of the broadcast, I mean, you didn't really have any sort of variety in the images you saw. It was just like basically the camera following the leader around. There was some interesting stuff going on down in the kind of the midfield. I know it was obviously a very important championship showdown, so you want to focus as much on the protagonist, the main protagonist, as much as possible. But Mick Doohan was having one of his best rides of his rookie season in 4th. We never really saw him. You had Ron Haslam, Kevin McGee, Wayne Gardner, all kind of fighting amongst each other at certain points, but there was not really any sense of that from what you got on TV. So it was. I mean, the broadcast definitely looks its age, I would say.
It's Haslam, I think, came from outside the top 10 on the second of the Pepsi Suzukis. He had been recovering from injury. He finished, top 5 for a British rider at the time. But Dave, one thing we should mention as well in that season is that the tyre situation was pretty diabolical. I mean, we had 2 brands, Michelin and Dunlop, but then within those companies, they had different tiers. The tyre manufacturers they're allocating the better quality product to the riders of their choosing. It seems all a bit unfair.
It's completely unfair. I mean, this is whenever someone mentions how great it would be to have tyre competition back, it would basically mean favoured riders being given the good tyres and being able to win while everyone else circulates around the back. I mean, can I have my list of things I don't like now? Because we might be here for some time. The tyres were terrible. You could tell that. Just the amount of movement on the bikes, to an extent, that's also the bikes themselves. It was really interesting because it's been years since I've actually watched one of those 500 races. But the way they sat on the bike, they were really sitting on the bike. What you have to remember is these had 32, I think, litre fuel tanks. 32 litres is what I've got on my bloody GS. It's when I fill it up, God, I know about it. You can really feel it. That is 23, 24 kilos of fuel that you're carrying around, and burning through that changes a lot, but it means it's just physically taking up a lot of space. If you look at the tank, they are stuck basically in one position on the bike because you can't move forward, because you've got to be able to fit all of this fuel in there. And that also changes the way that they ride. If you look at the way that, you could tell that Schwantz was, for example, really pushing, because you could see the rear grip slipping all the way. So see, it was like but all the way around the corner. But the lean angle, that would basically be an outlap compared to a modern MotoGP. And that's all tyres. That is pretty much all tyres. Also, close your ears, everyone. The bikes sound terrible. The modern MotoGP bikes, modern MotoGP bikes sound so much better than those old 500s. Those old 500s just sound whiny little things. You feel a modern MotoGP bike in your bowels, and that's what makes them great. So yes, I do. I own the two-stroke. I do like two-strokes, but the modern MotoGP bikes just sound much better. Also, because again, to come back to the fuel tank, because the fuel tank is much smaller on a MotoGP bike, you can actually move around more, and so you can hang off a lot more. So Schwantz's body position is really weird, looking at it from a modern perspective, where he's got sort of one bum cheek off, and he's got his body almost upright across the top of his bike, rather than having your body completely hanging off of the side. So it was genuinely really, really fascinating watching them ride.
Oh, the irony of a whiny little thing complaining about whiny little things.
It's why is it that I, the 61-year-old on here, are telling you not to be so nostalgic about the past? The past was rubbish. I lived through the past. It was awful. The present is better.
Yeah, you're past. This isn't. We're not watching videos of you in 1989, Dave. It's quite a different fare.
God for that.
I would even say that the best part of the crappy video on YouTube is just this blown out sound of those two strokes singing down the straight. I mean, you can almost smell the premix. It's it is nostalgic, Dave. I'll give you that. And a MotoGP bike does sound phenomenal. But these things were, I don't know, there's something about it that just sings. Please tell me I'm not the only one on this call, Neil, that feels this way.
Oh, no, it absolutely is a wonderful, wonderful... that's not to take anything away from modern MotoGP bikes or MotoGP bikes in the four-stroke era, but the sound of 500 two-strokes being ringed really was quite something. And also, there was that sensation that when, you would get off the throttle, there was no engine braking, so everything would kind of almost just go silent, and you would hear just the kind of the noise of the tires and the kind of the wind braking going past you, which was also like this kind of like shocking, you went from this very intense high pitch to like really like almost nothing at all, which was this fantastic contrast. So yeah, I would definitely take umbrage with David's comment there.
Should we mute him for this call for the month, or for maybe for the whole season for these outrageous comments?
Yeah, YouTube comment section, do your thing.
I'm sorry, but look, it's not my fault. You're all wrong.
Can we? How can we talk about the tires and not mention just some of those rear wheel slides? Some of those, images of complete and utter French and Japanese / British rubber abuse. I mean, what a sight! I think it's one of the corners is at Curve Zero, they call it, on the layout of the circuit, where it's a right-hander leading into the final right-hander coming onto the start straight. I mean, you mentioned there being only 5 cameras, Dave, and always showing the same angle, but some glorious stuff there. I mean, watching Schwantz in particular chasing, Lawson and Rainey on the Suzuki and just getting that thing sideways is also makes me go a bit furry. What do you reckon now?
Yeah, and the tyres did play a big role in how the season panned out, because Rainey was on Dunlops and the other chief contenders were all on Michelin's. And as Dave said previously, you had this kind of A category with Michelin, where I think they give their A tyres to only 4 riders that season: Gardner, Schwantz, 2 others I'm not too sure of exactly, but I'm pretty sure there were only 4. I think Spencer was one of them when he started the season with Yamaha. And then if you fell outside that category, then basically your hopes of being competitive were shot, really. But Rainey was on the Dunlops that year, and he felt that their performance was just way too up and down. They would kind of be decent one weekend and then not very good the next. He also felt that they would have difficulty with quality control. They would kind of differ from session to session. I think he was really at the end of his tether with the Dunlop tyres by the time we came to this Brazilian Grand Prix, and he was pretty much setting his sights on switching to Michelin for 1990, which he eventually did do, and then he cleaned up the next year. And I remember he said the first time he tested with Michelin, he looked at the timesheets and he was like, okay, so that's what I was missing last year. He said, he could just go immediately to lap record pace without having to absolutely ride at the very limit. So, he would, I'm sure Wayne would look back in the season and his view of it would have been, heavily tainted by the fact that, the Dunlops were quite unpredictable. And I think he even went to say that that crash he had in Sweden, that pivotal crash he had in Sweden was somewhat down to that.
Yeah, one thing, again, caused by tyres maybe, is just the back markers, the difference in performance. We saw in this race that sort of basically on 2 occasions, the reason that Schwantz, or something that helped Schwantz catch Lawson, was the fact that they both ran into back markers. And then again, Schwantz managed to get away a little bit because Lawson got caught up with back markers. They were genuinely just rolling chicanes. And you could also sort of see that that the riders were using, that Schwantz is phenomenal on the brakes, just absolutely phenomenal. But you could see Schwantz using the back markers. You're coming up to back markers and then you pass them so that that you've got someone in between you and the person behind you to actually sort of change it. I think that is, on the one hand, it is interesting, but also it's absolutely lethal, and I think it's much, much better. A question for you, Ad. This happens in MXGP as well, where you've got back markers in the way. Do riders use back markers? I mean, is it also a problem in MXGP?
I wouldn't describe it as a problem, Dave. It's just part of it's the same in any motorsport. It's part of the racecraft. I think when the leaders, you see more for riders struggling a little bit for maybe fitness or flow as the track changes. Depending also a little bit on the track, how kind of old school and narrow it can be. You could use back markers to your advantage. I would say it's obviously a lot more common, a lot more frequent to be able to be cutting through the pack in a motocross track, which is far smaller and far slower than a motorsport one. So I think it's more part of the fabric of the sport, I would say, and less perilous. But then, of course, we're depending where you are on the jumps, dealing with back markers in the respective levels. Like if you go to some of the flyaways events like Argentina and Brazil, and Brazil, there was, I went to Goiania because that was the site of the last Brazilian motocross Grand Prix in 2015. It can be a bit more pronounced, but yes. Moving on to, we've got 2 categories left, and it's still from Bill Simmons' Rewatchables podcast. I want to ask you guys, what has aged the worst from watching the 1989 Brazilian Grand Prix through this YouTube video? Can I just go first and say that the grid, what the fuck is going on there? There's 4 riders on the front of the grid, and then the second row does seem to be right beside them. And it kind of negates the point of qualifying at all. I'd say there's obviously a little bit more advantage now to having a decent lap in MotoGP compared to then. and also seeing the time differences. I mean, there was like nearly 1.5 seconds from pole position to fifth place. It's just kind of unheard of in MotoGP. So yeah, qualifying. What's the point? In 1989, that's one of my observations. What about you, Neil?
Yeah, also their idea of what constitutes a jump start was also very, very different to what we would consider a jump start to be now. If you see some of those old videos, like they were basically like halfway down to turn one before it would be like, no, sorry, you jumped the start. So yeah, that was something as well. Yeah, just, I mean, what you said, I think is fair. You know, you had big gaps all the way down the field. I think after 12th, everyone was lapped. Which kind of goes against my point of this being one of the strongest fields, if not the strongest field ever. But I think this was one exception to otherwise very, very competitive and compelling season. But that is more just down to, well, I think down to the quality of the riders perhaps, but also greatly down to the kind of the difference in machinery. You know, it's not the situation that we have now where every bike on the grid is a full factory bike, pretty much identical with the latest equipment put forth by a certain manufacturer. And yeah, the television broadcast, I mean, yeah, it looks its age.
Dave?
I mean, yeah, the depth of the field. There were
It's the most packed grid on history, Dave.
Yeah, exactly. There's 6 good riders, and the rest are all shit. It really is. The gaps between first, also the level of the machinery. If you think about, I mean, this is just part of professional sport now. Everyone's levels has been raised because everyone is training harder, everyone is working harder, everyone is focused more on motorcycle, on their sport. They live for their sport. It's changed so much. So the level of athletes is, I mean, sure, there are people who are so much further, so much better than the rest. But there are still, that second level of riders that level is so much higher than it was in 1989. And also it is nice to actually have just 20, all right, it's only 22 bikes, but it's 22 bikes. Any one of those bikes could win or could get on a podium.
Yeah, Mick Doohan was 4th and he was 20 seconds behind, Swans at the flag. MotoGP fields were usually the whole of the point scoring positions are under 20 seconds.
If you go through, because I've got this little blue book here, and if you go through that, then what you see on pretty much every page is basically from about 8th or 9th position, they're all at least 1 lap behind and sometimes 2 laps. That tells you all you need to know about the depth of field.
Neil, is there anything else behind your rose-tinted spectacles that you want to sort of mention because I think Dave is crushing you in this argument.
Shitting all over my dreams as a kid. Yeah, cheers, Dave. What a downer. I came into this full of enthusiasm. But
I've got some pipe and slippers for you, if you like.
Yeah. I mean, what else really is there to say? I think just other than, I think this remains one of the best kind of performances over a single season ever in history. I mean, Lawson, as you said before, the first and well, not the only, but the first rider to achieve back-to-back titles on different manufacturers. The fact that the 1989 NSR bike was such a pig to ride, it was genuinely one of the scariest Grand Prix bikes ever.
He didn't get married to it.
He didn't get married to it. He didn't. Yeah, as I said, 11 different chassis through the year. I think Wayne Gardner broke his leg on the bike from the third race. Mick Doohan mangled his hand pretty early into the season as well, and that was something that kept him out of a couple of races. Yet Lawson managed to finish every race, with the exception of that one that everyone boycotted in Misano, with the exception of Keeley and Simon Buckmaster and 1 or 2 other privateers.
Michael Woodruff.
Yeah. But yeah, he was just like the model of consistency and just gradually felt his way into the year. And yeah, I previously mentioned, I think it was round 11, where he had a real head-to-head with Schwantz at Le Mans and beat him hands down, even though Schwantz had been the kind of the faster guy all year. It was just like the sort of perfect case of a rider timing his best moment in the championship until like the real business end of the series. Yeah, sadly, this would kind of be really the end of Lawson as a Grand Prix force as well, because he would move back to Yamaha the following year as Rennie's teammate and Kenny Roberts' team. Had that huge crash at Laguna Seca, I think at round 2, where his brake pads fell out going down towards turn 1 at Laguna Seca, which is like a pretty awful and terrifying thing to happen. So he missed most of that season, and then he switched to Kachiva for 91 and 92. So this was kind of the end of him as like a proper, MotoGP frontrunner. But what a way to go out.
I think there's an argument, Neil, for maybe the 88 NSR 500 being worse than the 89. That was the bike, I think, that ruined Bubba Schobert's career as a Grand Prix rider. 89. Was 89? Well, no, but he was riding the 88, I think.
Oh, was he?
He was riding the year-old bike in 89, crashed at Laguna. Did he have a concussion, or was that the
but
injury
I think he rode into the back of someone, did he not?
He did.
Or someone rode into the back of him. Yeah, Kevin McGee, wasn't it? Yeah.
Yeah. But he was riding the 88 NSR on the, it was again like in a satellite team, wasn't it? It was sponsored by another quite prominent major company. Was it like Bud Light or something like that? I know Randy Mamola had, he had was it a Yamaha riding in Bud Light colours in the 1992 perhaps? But yeah. Anyway, Honda finally getting their shit together in MotoGP now, it has to be said. Can I just mention one other thing before we come on to our final comments, that it was very interesting that the 89 Brazilian GP only had the 250s there as a support class, didn't have the 125s. And there wasn't a great deal of mobility between the classes at that point. There were 125cc riders, there were 250 riders, and there were 500s. And if you look at sort of the results or some of the classification of the 250 GP and championship that year, names like Reinhold Roth, Jacques Cornu, Carlos Cardus, Loris Reggiani, all these kind of riders that were fighting for GP wins, they never really made an appearance on the 500s. It was only maybe Cito Ponce and Luca Cadalora from that sort of era that popped up and moved to the Premier class, and Kaczynski, like you mentioned as well, Neil. But I found that kind of curious, how we now know MotoGP as a pathway from Moto3, Moto2, MotoGP, but then it was still very much like particular bikes and particular names and particular physiques even for the specific classes. So that's another thing that kind of stuck in the 80s.
Different classes for different needs.
Indeed. Listen, the last thing I want to ask you guys is the top three, the big three, as they called them then, Lawson, Schwantz and Rainey. Who would be their MotoGP modern equivalents now? I mean, you were sort of waxing lyrical about Eddie Lawson, Neil. If we had to compare him to a MotoGP rider on the 2026 grid, who would he be?
Well, can I go? Because I think that I'd like to compare Eddie Lawson, Wayne Rainey and Kevin Schwantz to Marc Marquez, because they all have aspects of Marc Marquez. Also Mick Doohan. Mick Doohan was injured and he was riding through injured. Yeah, Marc Marquez. You saw Schwantz really taking risks, really pushing the bike, really wrestling with the bike, overriding a bike which wasn't really competitive. Yeah, Marc Marquez.
No, for me, Marquez is more Schwantz, Dave.
he's all of them. He's all of them. But I mean, like Schwantz, I would say maybe someone like Jorge Martin. Or Marco Bezzecchi. Yeah, maybe Acosta. Yeah, exactly. But I think Acosta is more talented and more of a fully rounded rider than Kevin Schwantz is.
Well, we won't be getting Kevin on the COTA preview show again this year. Thoughts, Neil?
Yeah, it's tough to say. I mean, a couple of years ago, I would say maybe Bagnaia was like your Eddie Lawson type, like without kind of flair or without really much need to set the world alight in terms of, blazing charisma and, big personality. But, what we've seen in Bagnaia of late is maybe extinguished that comparison somewhat. I think Rainey, in terms of just that beast mentality, I would compare it to Marc more than anything. Not necessarily his riding style, but just that sort of obsession, that total unerring obsession, which eventually, was his undoing. He just could not accept finishing in second place. So I think he's probably the one that I would compare closest to Marc. And Schwantz was, eventually got his shit together over a championship, but had to go through a lot of scrapes and a lot of punishing, bruising crashes to kind of get to that stage. So maybe he's more of a Jorge Martin, who's obviously been a bit like that in recent times as well. But Acosta is also a decent comparison with Schwantz. There's kind of otherworldly talent, But yeah, Acosta is doing it when he's 21. And, Kevin, the other thing about these guys is that when they're at their peak, they were all a decent bit older. They came into Grand Prix racing at the age of 26, 27, 28. They weren't coming through as 19-year-olds like we see with the current crop.
No, they were starting racing at 18, 17, 18, 19.
Road racing.
Yeah, road racing. But even then, they wouldn't be doing it. These kids, I mean, Mark's been racing since 3, 4, 5, something like that. It's completely different. One thing I do want to say about Eddie Lawson, I do think that Eddie Lawson is one of the more underrated riders. I really like Lawson, just the way that he rode, the way that he held himself. He was utterly dedicated to everything. It's just that he also absolutely hated the press. It was very much the Andrea Iannone of his time without being all flashy about it. But
Bezzecchi of his time, Dave. Come on, it's a more obvious example there.
Yes, exactly, very much so. So yes, I always think that Eddie Lawson gets a bit of a bad rap because of his personality.
It's terrible when people judge you on your personality, isn't it, Dave?
Completely unfair.
Yeah, one little detail that stuck out in one of the old motor courses that I was reading when prepping for this show was how Lawson was one of the, I think maybe the only 500cc rider that wasn't showing up at the local disco where everyone was getting completely smashed every night. Because I think he made an appearance for 15 minutes one night and was like, if I'm not getting drunk, then I'm not having fun, so I'm not going to be here. And that was a kind of dedication that back then was quite rare, which again shows you how far we've come.
Yeah, going back to what you're saying about Rainey, I mean, he's definitely the direct comparison to Marc Marquez, and I think you summed it up brilliantly there, Neil. For me, I'd put Pecco up with Eddie. I mean, it'd be steady Eddie and poised Pecco. But as a kid, and also maybe this is valid for some kids now who are sort of getting into MotoGP, I couldn't stand Lawson. I thought now I can admire him for what he did as a rider, as an athlete, I guess you could say. But the fact that he had zero interest in making a fantastically spectacular sport even more, magical for me, made me sort of resent him a little bit. I wanted to find out more. I wanted to be attracted to these characters and these personalities, and the fact that he was giving up nothing, which is, of course, his right to do. I just, didn't find it inspiring whatsoever. I wanted him to be beaten.
Yeah, it's a little bit like Casey Stoner had a little bit of that sometimes. Could be quite dour. Had no interest in all the rest of it. Or Danny Pedrosa, another one who absolutely hated the media side of it. I remember seeing an interview with Eddie Lawson at some point, a TV interview, and it was because then there were no media debriefs. It was you would knock on the door of someone's motorhome, and if they wanted to, they would open the door. And it's Eddie Lawson standing in front of his motorhome, and he really does look. He looks at. I've never seen such a look of disgust on someone's face as Eddie Lawson is being interviewed. I can't remember who it was with, but it was quite obvious that he thought less of this person than what he'd left in the toilet bowl earlier that morning. It was really quite it was impressive. It was an impressive amount of disdain.
There it is then. The last time that the 500/MotoGP went to Brazil and Goiania. Look it up on YouTube. Let us know what you think as well. Do you agree with any of our takes or Dave's takes? And give us a comment here or there, whether it's on social media, Discord, or of course our community chat channel amongst Patreon followers, or simply with the other lunatics on YouTube. Moving towards the present and the future, MotoGP. As we mentioned, we had a fantastic interview with Craig Scarborough. Let me try and get his name out correctly. We're going to play that in a moment. And then we're just going to give our predictions for the Grand Prix, which is going to be happening in a matter of days and hours. But first of all, some valuable insight into the state of aerodynamics in MotoGP before they start to wilt for 2027.
So I'm delighted to say that we are joined by a special guest, first time on the Paddock Pass podcast, Craig Scarborough, a freelance motorsport technical journalist. You may know him better as Scarbs on social media. His observations are very, very interesting indeed, not just on two wheels, but on four-wheel motorsport as well. Craig, welcome to the Paddock Pass podcast.
Thank you for inviting me on. It's great to be talking about motorbikes instead of four-wheeled things for a change.
Yeah, absolutely. Aerodynamics have been at the forefront of the talk in the MotoGP paddock after we saw this quite interesting system which Aprilia have brought in pre-season testing and then in the first race of the year. There was something of a precedent, though, because it's something that can be altered by the rider's position on the bike, the rider's behavior. And this was something that was, I guess, first seen probably in Formula One back in 2010. Now, our regular listeners will know that Dave and I are not necessarily in the best position to talk about this innovation that we saw in Formula One well back then. But I think you probably are a better place to talk about that. I mean, can you tell us a little bit about the F-duct system that came in with McLaren and how did that work exactly?
Okay, so yeah, the basic background is once you're getting involved in aerodynamics, and when we say aerodynamics, we're talking more about downforce than just streamlining, which, you know, was the old way of doing things in cars and bikes. Once you get into downforce is great. It pushes your tires onto the track in corners, gives you more corner speed. But almost every type of downforce comes with drag, and drag slows you on the straight. So in the perfect world, you'd want to have downforce in the corners, but none of the drag that it comes with along the straights. And over the years, particularly in Formula One, various mechanisms have been found to try and get that balance. And the problem is in Formula One, as it is in MotoGP, you can't have movable aerodynamic devices. You can't have flaps that open and close in bits and pieces. I know it's changed a little bit Formula One in recent years, but that's still quite tightly controlled by the regulations. So McLaren were thinking about this back in 2010, or probably a couple of years beforehand. It says, well, how can we get the aerodynamics to change when we want them to without having a movable piece? Well, obviously, they couldn't cheat, but they realized then that the driver is something that can be moved in the car that, can affect the aerodynamics, and the regulations don't really account for that because, the driver isn't, considered part of the bodywork of the car. So what they did, and it's a way more complicated system than we've seen now in MotoGP, so I'll kind of simplify it. But effectively what McLaren found was they would have an inlet on the front of the car that went into the cockpit and then just blew air into the cockpit naturally. But it also would then carry on to a whole series of ductwork above the engine. And if the driver covered this hole in the ductwork in the cockpit, actually with their elbow, there was for some reason, I believe they did it with their knee originally. Most of the other teams did it with the back of the hand, closed this duct. So rather than the air coming into the cockpit, it would carry along through that duct and via a whole heap of very clever aerodynamics would, rather than just route straight out the back of the car, route into the rear wing. And there was a slot across the back of the rear wing. And when that air blew through that, it effectively broke up the airflow through the wing, effectively stalled it in aircraft terms, which massively reduced the drag of the rear wing on the straights. So effectively what you would have is on the straights, the right driver would just push their elbow out, close the duct, lose all the drag, go faster in a straight line. And it was incredibly clever system. In its workings, incredibly simple. And actually, funnily enough, with one of the aerodynamicists at one of the teams said, also incredibly cheap to copy. So everyone else kind of went down this route, and they had this ridiculous situation on the straights that the drivers would only have one hand on the steering wheel. And when I say straights, that does include, high-speed bends as well, or wherever they felt they could get away with it. And the FIA quite rightly thought this isn't the way things should be done, because it was proven to be legal. Because of the definition of the driver is interacting with it, not movable bodywork. And it got banned, and it led to what we now call DRS, where you see the rear wing open on the straights. That's changed even more so in Formula One this year. So that's the precedent. And there's been other similar systems, kind of used here, there and everywhere, in particularly in Formula One over the years. But that's the key one. And I'm sure that was one of the big inspirations for the Aprilia team. That use an ex-Formula One wind tunnel in developing their bike.
It's always amazing how restrictions and regulations seem to inspire engineers to find ways around it. Whereas, I mean, like the really cheap thing would be just to have electronically changed movable aerodynamics, but the rule makers decide they don't want that, and then you get these amazing. I mean, exactly the same with ride height devices and all the rest of it. It's just a way of changing it. I have a question about the Aprilia, because what we can see for sure, 100%, is where the air comes in, and we can see the ducts on the side of the fairing where the rider's elbows will normally, or well, their forearms would normally rest anyway, so they can close those ducts off. Now, I've seen several explanations about how it might work, but what we don't know is where the air comes out, where it gets channeled to. And I think that changes, where it comes out, it's going to really change a lot what you're trying to achieve with the bike. So what do you think they are trying to achieve, and why?
Well, I mean, I think it's quite interesting because they could be, I mean, as I said, in Formula One, you get two effects. You can get more downforce in the corners, or you can reduce the drag on the straights. I don't know enough about the aero of MotoGP to work out which one is the bigger. So we'll assume that they're aiming for both. So I produced the drawings that I did that, kind of led me to be here today from speaking to Simon Patterson, one of the MotoGP guys that actually, did the exclusive and found out how the system worked. He went to Aprilia and they showed it to him. So, I completely trust him. So we can see the inlets just on the front of the fairing. That goes, and you can actually see them passing inside the fairing, going into the tank and the fairing sides. And then as you see those ducts out by the rider's forearms. And as we understand it, is when the rider puts their forearms over those vents at the side of the frame there, it then directs air down towards the cooling outlets. And Aprilia have 3 very small ones on the side of the fairing. And somehow it's stopping the air blasting out the sides of these cooling outlets on the side of the fairing, and probably ducting it inside and coming out under the tail unit and out, the lower parts of the fairing. So what I'm guessing they're doing is when the rider is in corners, so, they've got their arms are out, their legs are out, they're, barely sitting on the bike, the air coming out of those side vents would go quite easily in between the rider's arms and legs, probably through to the leg fairings, just behind the seat, and to that, series of wings and fins that they have on the seat tail unit. So getting air to them in corners means, well, you're going to get the downforce that they produce rather than the rider blocking some of that airflow. So that's one potential benefit. The other benefit then is when the rider is tucked in and their forearms are covering these vents, you get this diverted airflow effect that goes down and stops the air coming out of these cooling outlets at the side of the fairing. So what that would do is the air that comes out creates outwash. So although it's actually just air, it's creating an obstacle to the airflow around the bike. So it's making the bike feel physically bigger in terms of frontal area than it actually is. So if you stop that air coming out, suddenly the whole bike's effective wake through the air that obstructs, the bike pushing through the air gets slimmed down a little bit more. And that means that you'll get more straight line speed because you're not getting, that obstruction to the airflow. And there is the argument as well that maybe because the air's now not hitting the leg fairings and the seat tail unit fairings and wings and bits and pieces that they have on there, that they're not producing as much drag. Now, I would have thought the rider being tucked in on a MotoGP bike would actually obstruct the airflow to those anyway. But again, it's one of those things that we really can't measure with our eyesight. It's just, maybe that's one of the maybe secondary or even tertiary effects of doing this. So they're getting something in both in corners, in straights potentially with this system, which means it's super handy. And as a lot of people pointed out that I'd actually forgotten about, is that the Aprilia riders seem to get very hot on the bike. So having those vents blowing around the rider, in the corners when they're not there, may actually just help the rider be a little bit cooler as well, which is always a benefit.
That is fantastic, Craig. Thanks very much for your time, your insights. That was fascinating stuff to hear. If you want to read more of Craig's stuff, you can find him on social media at Scarbs Tech. Well worth a follow. Lots of interesting insight there. A lot of stuff on mostly on Formula One, but occasional bits and pieces on bikes as well.
I will say the only F1 journalist I actively follow, which for me is quite high praise, really.
Yeah, I mean, Yeah, for me, it's not about just Formula One. I mean, Formula One's, it's kind of a cash cow for any motorsport journalist. But, I cover MotoGP. I was a biker and interested in bikes before I got into F1. So, I think it's got to the stage now where, MotoGP is something that should be lauded for the technology that it has involved. So, keep following, please.
Yeah. Thanks very much, Craig Scarborough, for your time. And until the next time on the Paddock Pass Podcast.
Thank you.
Okay, guys, let's finish up this show with some bold predictions. And these really are going to be bold because we've got absolutely no idea who's going to adapt to this circuit, who's going to find grip. Is there going to be any grip? I think we can confidently predict that there's going to be a rowdy and enthusiastic crowd at this particular Grand Prix. But Neil, if you had to, throw your dice on the table, take a full-size bet, what are your thoughts?
I mean, it's really very, very difficult to look past the reigning world champion because he normally excels in these new venues that we visit. I mean, we went to Hungary last year and he laid waste to the opposition in a very controlled, dominant manner. And also, there is a decent chance that the track is going to be quite dirty. I think, especially on the first day or two, it's going to really need some cleaning up and bedding in. So, and we know that Marc is just an expert in these kind of low grip conditions. So I think he's going to be a decent play. But also really excited to see what Bezzecchi can do. I mean, Aprilia can also be pretty good in low grip conditions. Maybe that's a bit further into the past than recent past. But, you think back to 2022 Argentina, was it their first ever MotoGP win? In really low grip conditions. I think those are going to be the two protagonists. I know that's quite a shocking thing to hear, but yeah, there you go.
Yeah, I don't fancy your chances of a big win on those bets. David, what about you? Could Aprilia still maintain their authority?
And I mean, it's hard to look past Marc Marquez at this track because it is going to be track is going to be dirty. It's a new track. Marc learns tracks quickly. He's very good in really sketchy conditions, in understanding the conditions. He's had a couple more weeks to strengthen himself, to recover from illness. I think he's going to be really hard to beat. Really looking forward to see what Pedro Acosta can do because I think he is going to be. I think he's going to be quite formidable here. He seems to be in good shape. And again, he's the kind of rider who's used to overriding the bike. Might also be, Brad Binder, again, sketchy conditions. He's the sort of rider who can actually do well with this. I think Neil makes an excellent point about Hungary being a really, really good guide for it. Again, the Aprilias, yes. Bezzecchi is definitely has to start as one of the favourites behind Marquez, but also Jorge Martin, because Martin had a pretty decent race at Hungary, given his fitness condition and the amount of time he'd been off the bike.
Also, Bezzecchi did absolutely smoke everyone. We went to India back in 2023, first time we went there, only time we went there. And maybe that is also a decent yardstick of kind of measuring how this weekend could play out.
I would, on the same criteria as Marc, to a lesser degree, of course, I'd say Jack Miller could be, one of the better performing riders on the Yamahas. The likes of also Diogo Moreira, we have to mention him, home turf. What can he do on the Honda? But I think your call about Acosta is very wise, Dave, because as he showed in his debut year, he's a rider that doesn't really need huge learning curves to be able to get up to pace. And depending on the level of grip, and how the track is and how it chews up the tires. We're not using the special heat tires from Buriram here, are we? So that's something else. And I think I'd like to predict a resurgence from Maverick Vinales because I think the Thai GP was. Why are you both laughing?
You've predicted Jack Miller, Diogo Moreira, and Maverick Vinales for this weekend.
Not for victory. I'm just saying, just keep an eye. I think Miller would be it will surprise people, and Moreira's, on home.
Not on the Yamaha. Nobody is going to surprise anyone on the Yamaha this year.
Watch out, Pedro. Watch out, Marc.
Dear. Well, you're saying so the Yamaha is the Aston Martin, basically, of the MotoGP crop currently. But
I don't know. Anyway, I don't know what Aston Martin is. Isn't it one of those things that James Bond drives?
Oh, very good. Yes. Yeah, he does drive an Aston Martin. Well done.
So
Dave.
what you're saying is that basically what they need to fit on the Yamaha is some machine guns at the front, plus a thing for scattering nails coming out the rear.
An ejector seat would be very handy for people.
Yes, an ejector seat. Yeah, but there'll be one or two Yamaha riders who would be all too happy to pull the ejector seats just to skip this the rest of this year.
Yes, indeed. Listen, thank you to Craig. Thank you to Renthal for backing the Paddock Pass podcast. David, Neil, thanks ever so much for the laughs and reflections and information. Most of it completely useless, as usual, for our listeners and viewers. But we'll be back, as we mentioned, in a matter of hours and days with our first Paddock Note show from the Brazilian Grand Prix.